tariffs, commercial trade, and what's going to happen.
Watching China closely for 40 years. In last year, Donald Trump said he would use tariffs.
Olá, eu sou o Luciano Timm, sócio fundador do CMT Advogados, e você está ouvindo o Conectando Direito, um podcast quinzenal que une o direito a outras áreas do conhecimento. E nesse episódio, da nosso quarto ano, será o primeiro em inglês, nós vamos receber Phillip Chritton. Phillip Chritton é Visiting Fellow, é um professor visitante da Universidade da Carolina do Sul, Darla School of Business, e foi Deputy General Counsel Internacional da UPS. Todos conhecemos a UPS no Brasil, e se formou em Direito na Columbia University. So I will turn to English right now. Very happy to have you here. I just made a brief presentation, Phil. Thank you very much, and very nice having you today.
Yeah, thank you. It's my pleasure, Luciano, to be here to talk about this important topic.
Yeah. So today, the topic will relate to tariffs, commercial trade, and what's going to happen in the near future in the commerce. And Phil, I made a brief presentation, but normally everybody knows UPS and your background is great, but could you please share with the audience a bit of your background so far?
Yeah, sure. So I've been an international attorney for 32 years, and some of that was in private practice, and most of it was with UPS. And I lived in Beijing, China for 6 years, where your president is now visiting. And I also lived in Singapore for 11 years. And the last 10 years with UPS, I had responsibility for all international legal matters of the company. And for the last 2 years, I've been speaking to law and business students. So I'm available on LinkedIn if anybody in your audience would like to reach out. I'm always interested in speaking with people.
Great. I think it would be a great conversation considering your background in Asia, and being a common lawyer would be very helpful for our audience. So, Philip, first of all, and maybe it's not in the script, but I can imagine that after so many years, you can see a lot of changes in Asia and in the commerce. What's your feeling right now before we get started with the more technical stuff of tariffs?
Well, I've been watching China closely for 40 years, and it's been very interesting to watch China go from a developing country where people were all riding bicycles, and no one had any cars. That was my beginning when I arrived in Beijing in 1984. And then to slowly watch this country develop. And when I first went to China, most Chinese people, 80%, I believe, were living in the countryside. And now most of them are living in cities. And then to work as a lawyer and for a company involved in the logistics supply chain in China, it's been absolutely fascinating to watch China go from a friend and a place of production and opening to now this rival and competitor and global powerhouse that's competing with the United States and with Europe, and also impacting Latin America. So it's been a slow evolution, and I think the question is, will anything change? Or anything change very quickly? because it's taken 40 years for the supply chain, to develop, involving China, Asia, Latin America, and in many cases, China is the only country that produces a lot of items that are used in the United States and other countries. So President Trump can say the tariff is going to be 145% or something else. But the supply chains are, they're built. And so it's, I think, difficult to have a fast change. So, we can definitely talk more about that, because I think it's quite interesting.
Sure, sure. So then moving to tariffs and the so-called Liberation Day. Yeah, that's
Well,
under dispute. uh, how would you assess the initial reaction of the American side? How American companies are reacting? Are there sectors that seem more sensitive or more vocal in their opposition or support?
yeah.
What can you share with
Well,
us?
yeah, thanks, Luciano. I think when the Liberation Day announcement was made, there was a lot of shock, panic, maybe anger. And during the election, during his campaign last year, Donald Trump said he would use tariffs. And we know from when he was president the first time, he used tariffs, which of course Joe Biden continued. But no one expected 145% tariff on China, which changed yesterday, to 30%. And also, no one expected that the tariffs would be worldwide, that they would be on every country. And I think those were the big surprises. And I think maybe I would ask a question, which I think about a lot, which is, why does Trump love tariffs so much? Why does he love tariffs? And I think the answer to that question is that in the American US form of government, there should be controls on the president from Congress or the courts. But I think Trump loves tariffs because he's taken a position that he can decide at any minute what the tariff should be on any country. And it gives him a feeling of control over everyone, over China, over Europe, over Latin America, over the American people. And he can just do it with his pen. He can wake up in the morning and make a decision, or when he's going to bed. Now, there's going to be some challenges to that approach. And in fact, this week, in the Court of International Trade in New York City, some US companies are bringing a lawsuit against Trump to say that the tariffs are illegal because they are a tax, and only the US Congress can approve a tax. So we'll see what happens with that court case. But, going back to Trump's perspective on this, he and his team have given a number of strategic reasons why they're doing this. Fair trade. They want to increase US manufacturing and make it like the 1950s or 1960s. Another strategy is to raise revenue, because the US government will collect money from the tariffs. And then another strategy is to control illegal drugs, because the claim is that China and Mexico and even Canada is shipping illegal drugs to the United States. So we should use tariffs as a punishment. But the problem is that some of those theories and strategies are contradictory, which is why I think it's really just Trump loves tariffs, because it gives him personal control at any time, and he doesn't need to ask anyone. So you asked about businesses and the response from US companies. I would say there's really two parts to it. One is the short-term response, and then the long-term response. In the short term, the response is minimize the damage. And so companies, when they knew that Trump was going to put on the tariffs, first of all, they tried to build up their inventories. And then when the tariffs were announced, they tried to negotiate with their suppliers in Asia to divide up the cost where possible. Sometimes they tried to find other suppliers. That's not easy. And then more recently, when the tariffs hit, 145%, some companies just stopped orders. Sometimes when the ships were on the ocean, they said, stop. Now, it's also interesting that some corporations are using this emergency to justify cost cutting. So some companies, they've announced layoffs and reductions of headcount, and they said, well, it's because of tariffs. And so companies are using tariffs to justify a lot of things. And then, of course, it's also important in the short term to realize that yesterday, the US and China met in Switzerland and agreed to drop the tariffs. But it still takes several months for the factories in China or other places to start the production again and produce the products, and then for those products to get on the ocean in the ships. So this short-term period is very interesting. But I think the more basic question is, what about the long term? Will these tariffs change behavior of corporations? Now, in my mind, supply chains started to change in 2022 after Russia invaded the Ukraine. And the reason why that impacted supply chains is corporations and CEOs, they looked at what happened with Russia invading Ukraine, and they said, well, what happens if China invades Taiwan? And suddenly we have to try to reduce our supplies from China. So it caused a lot of companies to think about their supply chains and maybe to move production from China to Vietnam or to India or Mexico, any other markets. But as I said earlier, it's very hard to change these supply chains, especially with China. China has 40 years of building up its workforce to produce these goods. And it's not very easy to move those factories to Vietnam or other places because they don't have the workforce ready. Now, in some cases, American companies asked for exceptions to the tariffs. So for example, Apple, Tim Cook, he asked, let's make an exception for iPhones. So I guess Apple's such an important company, they were able to get it, but we don't know in the long run if they'll be able to keep it. There are also these legal challenges which could really change things immensely. Maybe a court in the U.S. will make a decision that Trump does not have the legal authority to issue these tariffs. That could change things very quickly. We don't know. But, and Trump himself is very erratic, right? I mean, no one knows what he's going to do from one day to the next. One day he might say China is a threat. The next day he might say Xi Jinping is his friend. And maybe even in the same day, in the same hour, he might say that. So we don't really know. So the conclusion here is that I don't think companies will change their supply chains because it's very difficult to do. I think right now companies are going to wait. They're going to watch. Maybe they will start to do some planning, but they're not going to change their supply chains right now. That's what I think is happening.
Yeah, it's a great way to see and think about what's going to happen. You mentioned a lot of things. One is the way that the president of the US behaves, right? And the possibility to understand. I have a friend who wrote a paper about using game theory as if it were a kind of chicken game. I don't think so. I would be more like erratic, so lack of strategic thinking. I also saw it's amazing because I saw a lot of people in Brazil kind of leftist liking this move, which is kind of awkward because they used to hate Trump for the other things he used to say or he says. But of course, are people that believe in the role of the state, and we are going to discuss that in a little, very shortly. But since you have been there in China, I mean, could you foresee what happened next? I mean, China becoming a powerhouse of production, in which you can see Tim Cook saying that the skill, everything they have, the culture of productivity in China. Could you see that happening? Or, I would imagine, I can say that living in England, I saw Germany, industry taking over England after the Treaty of Rome. But because Germans have this, yeah. How about China? Could you foresee that? Have you chosen China for that reason?
Well, I think China's super interesting, and you have to understand Chinese culture to a certain extent. I mean, this is a country with a history that goes back several thousand years, and part of the culture is it is a virtue in Chinese culture. It's called chirku, which means the ability to eat bitterness. And that means that you are prepared to make sacrifices, and that's a good thing. And so, like Americans are very interested in consumer goods, but and Chinese are also. But the government policy is to export the goods and not to, think too much about the welfare of the domestic population. And now the standard of living in China has gone up a lot, and there are a lot of rich Chinese, super rich Chinese, and the middle class is very big, but the government is willing to sacrifice some happiness of the population in order to achieve the policy goals. And the media is controlled by the state, and so there's not a lot of opposition, and so on. Now, there are limits to this, and during COVID, the government put very strict controls over the movement of people. And far beyond any other country. And at some point, finally, there was some, response from the population, and they had to ease up. So I think that China has some cultural, historic, political factors which make it, a very strong competitor in the world. Also, of course, a very strong education system. China produces more engineers than any country in the world. And so you pull all this together, and it's a very formidable, economic power. I guess the question is, at what point does the population say, enough? And even, I think even the Beijing leadership knows there are limits. And I think that for better or worse, the Trump tariffs finally did put some pressure on Beijing, because they were seeing factories get shut down, and a lot of blockage of their exports and so on. So I think the Chinese in the end were happy to make a deal. They don't want to have a kind of, I don't know, your game theory of a game of chicken. At some point, there's a reality.
Yeah. So I saw some people also claiming that Trump won because some Americans were not happy, what people would call blue collar, that lost their jobs. But if you look at the numbers, the US has never been so rich comparing to
Yeah.
Europe even, right?
Well,
So,
yeah, and you and I spoke previously about the example of Brazil. When countries try to block or limit imports in order to promote local production, in general, those policies have not been very successful. I guess Brazil, India is another example. They tried to promote local production. And if you go further back, you think about the Soviet Union or even China. During the 1950s and 60s, they had this thing called the Great Leap Forward, where the Chinese wanted to have everyone at their house, make steel. It was crazy. But so there's a lot of examples. But I think last week I was visiting my hometown, and I went to the high school, and I met with about 80 high school students, and we were talking about the tariffs and and what's going on. And I said, okay, if we're going to move these factories to the United States, for example, Nike shoes, I said, how many of you would like to go to a factory and make Nike shoes? And I can tell you, none of the students said yes. I don't think. Americans are good at making certain things. Technology, airplanes, cars. There's a lot of products that we are good at. But those kind of daily household items, toys, clothes, we used to make those things, but today no one makes them, and no one wants to make them.
yeah. Only if you allow immigrants to do this kind of work.
So it's complicated. I think now another possible solution for the United States would be using technology to manufacture goods, to use automation. And I think that is coming. Now, automation is great, but it doesn't usually employ many people. And then there are some products which are very, very difficult to make using automation. And the Wall Street Journal did a feature a couple of weeks ago about companies that were trying to automate manufacture of shoes for Nike and others. And they were saying that they put millions of dollars into making machines, but the machines just couldn't make the shoes. So anyways, these are some big challenges. So I'm very skeptical that these tariffs will force manufacturing to the U.S. In a meaningful way.
Yeah, and maybe the technological industry are more worthy to have, and that's where
Yeah.
the U.S. is stronger. But yeah, and then of course, I have to, and you brought this up, and I was about to do it. I mean, in Brazil, it's more or less the same idea that because of the war, our First and Second World War, our president had this idea of building and manufacturing everything here, not to depend on others. So we're gonna have our oil company, we're gonna have our airway company, and we're gonna have our iron company. Well, to be fair, I mean, at the beginning, this is considered the miracle of Brazil during the 60s and 70s, in which we increase our GDP in, let's say, maybe as an average 5% each year. So Brazil started as an under or developing country, and now it's considered a mid-income country. But then it became very outdated, and in the 90s we needed to privatize those state-run companies. And so I would ask you, I mean, what's your feeling on that? I mean, in Brazil, protectionism led to high consumer costs and lack of competitiveness, right? I mean, because you don't compete, you have the market for you. Do you see similar risks emerging for the US as a result of that?
Like I said, I think that the American consumers they want the best goods from the whole world, and I don't think that people here will be satisfied to just let's localize everything. I just don't see that's going to work. And now there are certain examples in recent history. For example, in the 1980s, President Reagan struck a deal with Japan to limit the number of automobiles from Japan coming, because he wanted to give some relief to American automakers. And I think that maybe in some limited capacity like that, there could be a benefit. But the problem was, like in that case, the Japanese just raised, they sent fewer cars, but they sent their more expensive cars to the US. So, I personally, I just think competition is the better way to go. And, let every company compete to make the best things. It's very interesting when you look at an iPhone. And I don't know, do you have an iPhone? So I recently saw when you open up an iPhone and you look at the content of that phone, it's assembled in China mostly. A few are assembled in India, but almost all are made in Zhengzhou or Shenzhen or Shanghai, China. But the technology for the phone is mostly in California. The design. So, that's the good stuff in my mind. You got engineers, coming up with the design. And then the parts, I mean, they come from Japan, Korea, and many countries in the world. And then they go into that phone, So recently I read a quotation by a professor at Oxford, and he said, "No one country can make an iPhone." And his point was that, no country has all of those, things. And to me, that's the way it should be.
Yeah, I think you're right, because former president of Brazil, President Cardoso, has an article from the 90s when China was rising, and his view was that to be a leader in innovation, you need democracy in order for ideas to freely flow. It's hard to have a market of ideas if it's not a democracy and the state controls everything. You might, I mean, to a certain extent, he claims Japan reached, well, Japan was not a dictatorship, but it's not a very, the best case of democracy. And China, of course, in that regard, is a lot worse in terms of democracy. But maybe China reached a point in which it will be hard to really create innovation, but it's a case in itself, right? Because it's not the West. I remember a book wrote by a professor from Singapore called Kishore Mahbubani. And the book is quite provocative, saying, has the West lost it? And
Yeah. I personally, so going back to China, I think it's a huge laboratory of all of these ideas, right? And clearly the state is in charge and has very firm control on policy. But probably the most successful period of time in China was in the early 2000s and early 2010s, when the government kind of pulled back and they let the economy go a little wild, and free. And suddenly China was having all of these private companies and IPOs and, billionaires. I mean, which is pretty interesting, right? When you think, like, when I went to China in 1984, people were on bicycles, but billionaires. And then I think Xi Jinping, when he came to power in 2012, and I think he had this idea that he had to control the ideology of the country, and that he could control the ideology, but the economy would still continue to grow and be successful. But I think there's some tension there, right? That, to your point, if so, for example, he put pressure on the billionaires and on some of these companies, and he promoted the state-owned, government companies. And so there's some question whether that's really been successful, right? And so, we'll see. I think one other point that really we should make about free trade, since we're talking free trade, that I think is really important, especially maybe for the younger generation, is that my personal view is that free trade, it makes the world safer. That when countries start to build these walls, and try to do everything within their borders, they start to believe that they don't need good relationships with other countries. But when trade is integrated around the world, it forces countries to deal with each other, right? I mean, we saw this weekend, we had, senior people from the US and from China meeting in Switzerland because they had to, and so I think we really need to also think about that aspect of peace and security. I mean, it sounds utopian, but I really believe that it's important that if China thinks it can be independent, then maybe they won't care what the rest of the world thinks. So But
Yeah, and
maybe President Lula, when he's in Beijing, he can come back with a view on that.
with some ideas. Well, living in a country that does not have nuclear power, I prefer to believe that we might find an international kind of international consensus of international institutions, and like it would be sad if we need to go through another war to realize, that we need to come back. But history, I used to have a history professor, that history, it's not like Marx would predict that it's us, in
A
certain
straight line.
direction. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's not.
Well,
So, yeah, please.
I mean, one thing that I think is like, is there any good news in all of this? And I think the good news is that um, in the United States, people were becoming very skeptical about free trade. They were starting to question, is it really a good thing? But I think now, after this kind of scare, this shock about, hey, if we're going to go to the store and everything is going to cost, twice as much or three times as much, or maybe it's not there because it isn't being made. I think it forced Americans maybe to think like, well, maybe free trade is a good thing. And I was reading, I think it was the New York Times. They said a recent poll said that now 80% of Americans think free trade is important.
Oh,
So
that's good news.
I think if you asked that question, a year ago or 2 years ago, I'm sure the answer would be very different. So sometimes you need a shock to remind you.
Yeah, well, that would be a good that would be good news, certainly. But then, since global trade is shifting, maybe to some extent, maybe not as one would expect, imposing tariffs, as we discussed before, how you see American companies in making their strategies? I mean, how they are strategizing, if I can use this verb, in this
Yeah.
new era.
Well, I think that all companies right now are thinking about all of this, their trade, their supply chains, their alternatives. And they're even looking at things like I saw the term supply chain engineering, where you know maybe the components are made in China, and if the tariff is high in China, then they will get the components from China, but they will assemble in Thailand because in Thailand the tariff is lower. So there's all this kind of stuff, right? Um, but I think that the tariff shock.
If you allow me, Phil, that's what I heard, that was happening with Russian gas and oil. I mean, it was coming back to Europe through another channel. I mean, because they still need the gas
Yeah,
and the oil.
but those are, I mean, to me, those are kind of short term. They're games. They're kind of like day to day operational issues. But I think that the tariff shock has been a lot more than just supplies, because U.S. companies, for example, are also big exporters, and so China is a big source of supply, but it's also a big market. So if you're Tim Cook sitting there in Apple, or you're Elon Musk, and you're trying to sell your products in China, you got to be thinking about that. I was reading about American beef, going to China, and Brazilian beef going to China. So all of that is taken into effect. When the tariffs were up, the U.S. dollar was going down. So there's a lot of financial impacts, interest rates going up, inflation going up. some U.S. companies, for example, airlines, they make financial projections to their shareholders for the next few quarters, and some of them just said, we're not going to make any predictions about our financial results for the rest of the year because we have no idea. So there's a lot of impacts like that are not just supply chains, right? But I think that for companies, this is really a crisis for them. They've got to think about their customers. Are they going to suddenly buy less because prices went up, or are they suddenly going to buy more because consumers think prices are going to go up 2 months from now? I mean, who can understand all that stuff? You've got to think about hiring, and right now the thought is in the U.S. unemployment is low, but no one is hiring. It's like everything is kind of static. And then you've got to think about, if the tariffs are there, are you going to raise prices, or should you cut your costs to try to absorb them? I've even heard companies doing things like, if they're selling a certain product, like socks for your feet, like maybe in the past, the company would sell a package with 8 pairs of socks in it, but now they'll sell with 6 pairs to make it like cheaper, appear cheaper. So it's causing a tremendous amount of chaos. The other thing, though, that is important to recognize is that there's a division between big companies and small companies. And I think for the big American companies, they will be okay. They will find a way. They'll find suppliers, or maybe they will find a political solution. If you're big enough, you can ask Donald Trump for a favor, some help. But if you're a small company, and right now there's a lot of stories in the United States about small businesses across the country. These are people who they invent things. They come up with a product that's very useful and that people want to buy, but they will find a factory in China to make that product. And now, if the tariffs go up, they can no longer get those products from China. So all these little businesses are going to suffer. And these small companies, they don't have the resources to look in Vietnam or Mexico or other places. So there could be some very big shocks for small companies.
Yeah. And I just remember a friend who owns a business in Florida it's part of, it's connected to Amazon, but allowing finance to small and mid-sized companies. And all of them are really in panic. Well, maybe before yesterday, but anyway, Philip, thank you very much for sharing this initial thoughts, because I guess that if we have this conversation in a month or two, we might have more information. But it was very interesting learning from your experience, and also because you are on site. Yeah, you are in the U.S. right now, where the action is taking place. And well, if you could say a few conclusion words, maybe.
Yeah, my view is that I think that supply chains are going to be difficult to change, and so I think things will continue for the most part to be the same suppliers. But over the long run, I think there will be a bit of movement. I think let's talk about Latin America. I think this is an opportunity for Latin America because they can leverage the competition between the U.S. and China, for example, and so that I think these things are a good thing. I'm an optimist, and I think that even Trump has learned that you can't go too far. Uh, I think he is also looking at the American people, and people are pretty unhappy right now with what he's doing. They're very concerned. When
He apparently, I was in the US in March, and it was just in a moment in which the left competitor in the presidency of Canada just
yeah,
passed the right wing guy, and apparently Trump was responsible for that
yeah,
change.
yeah, and also Australia, same thing. Um, Look, the best thing is, like you said, let's hope no wars. But sometimes a shock like this can bring some good things. So I want to be optimistic about it.
Yeah, it's this word that crises are sometimes opportunity.
Yeah,
Now that we are speaking, I just remember that we have Andy Warhol uh,
yeah,
exposition in Brazil, and I just saw this picture or this, let's say, yeah, I think it's was a painting or a serigraphy. I'm not sure what it
yeah.
is, but it's an art representation of the first Mao. But it was very nice having you.
Yeah.
Hope to
Well,
see you in the near
let's.
future.
Thank you, Luciano. Let's keep talking.
Sure.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Okay. Bye bye.